I want you to open your Bibles to the book of Hebrews. We're going to study an individual who God came to and said, I want you to have a heart for the world. And he was posed with a couple of questions that he had to give some pretty serious answers to, questions I think God wants to give us this morning. Hebrews chapter 11, the man's name is Abraham. God's going to take him and move his heart first and foremost before he even moves his life. In the same way, God wants to move our heart. And we're given three stories in Hebrews chapter 11 that kind of pose these three questions that every one of us have to answer if we're going to let God expand our heart for the world. So here's the first story, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with the foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Here's the first question you have to answer that Abraham had to answer. How do you see the world? As a threat or as an opportunity? It's easy to see the world as a threat when you look around the global world and you see the crisis we're in. And you see the confusion, and you see the danger, and you see the pain. It's easy to see the world as a threat when you look around your own neighborhood at times. But if you see the world as a threat, it will dictate how you live out God's passion through you. If you see the world as an opportunity, it will dictate how you live out God's passion. Abraham had to make this decision. How will I see the world? When he moved to where God wanted him to be, nothing was really worked out yet for him, and he had to make this choice as to how he would see the world, and that would determine his authority, his activity, and his attitude. And it's difficult, and this passage actually reflects the difficulty we have here, because it says he's a stranger, but he makes his home there. Do you ever feel like a stranger in this world? It's like, I don't quite fit here, I don't quite belong here, and yet I'm supposed to make my home here. What is my position in the world? If I see the world as a threat and I'm only a stranger here, then I have this sense of weakness where I'm completely out of control of what's happening. I don't know how it is in Australia, but in America, in California, I'll go to the gas station and I'll pump some gas into my car and I'll pay a certain amount and I'll go a week later and it'll be like 50 cents higher. And I'm thinking, who makes this decision? I have no idea. I'm fully out of control. And you look at the world around you and everything that's happening, and oftentimes when you see that it's a threat and you're out of control, you just stay within your tight little world. If you feel like you're a stranger, then you get this fear that can paralyze you. I'll be honest with you, I don't like the world at times. I don't like the language they use. I don't like the values they live out. I don't like how they demean my Lord Jesus Christ. And because I don't like the world at times, I'm tempted to remove myself from the world. And I will separate myself from the very people that I am called to reach. If I see the world as a threat, even to my own faith, then I will just stay within my own little world. And I don't grab God's heart for the world, and my world becomes smaller. And my mindsets and my faith become smaller. And what takes place when I see the world as a threat is I abdicate my responsibility. When you see the problems in the world, it's really easy to say, if the governments would get their act together, if the educational systems would get their act together, if families who have immorality going on would get their act together. As Christians, when we see the world as a threat, it's really easy to blame other factors, and we abdicate our responsibility. When God shifts our heart, part of the shifting is this embracing of, I see this opportunity, and it begins with me saying, this is my responsibility. I've been given the power of the Holy Spirit, as Wayne said. I've been given the light. I've been given the truth. This is my responsibility, and my heart grows. Think of this phrase, taking responsibility for something that is not your fault. Who does that define for you? Jesus. He took responsibility while you were yet sinners. He died for you, for something that was not his fault. And now he says, I give you the mandate. And he comes to Abraham and he says, Abraham, how are you going to see the world? And if you're here this morning and you see the world around you as a threat and there is fear in you, God actually wants to minister to you. He doesn't want to judge you or criticize you. He says, if you let me give you my heart, you will see the world as an opportunity and there will no longer be fear. Now there will be faith. How did Abraham handle this mix? I'm a stranger here, but it's supposed to be my home here. How do you balance that? It says in this text that he looked forward to a city that enabled him to make his home here now. Did you know that 1 out of every 30 verses in the New Testament talk about the return of Christ? And we almost never talk about the return of Christ? But for Abraham, knowing that life on this earth does not define my existence, there is another existence to come that's more real and greater, changes how I live on this earth. I open my heart to God and the opportunity that He has for me. And that gives me an authority and a responsibility and a faith, which is what the world needs. And God moves our heart if He's going to move our church. This morning I want to share with you a couple of heroes of mine. One is a member of Hope Center. He's an engineer by trade, and he's a really smart guy. And he's got a good home and a good family. He's well established. And a few years ago, he was given the opportunity in a very poor country in Asia to go in and do some consulting and help in that country. Now, you have to understand, poor country, they're not flying him over there. He's got to pay his own way. They're not paying him any wages. High sought-after engineer. Does he see it as a threat? It's a threat to my financial existence. It's a threat to my family. It's not the safest country to be in at that time. It's a threat to my existence. Or does he see it as an opportunity? And over the last years, he's been going there year in and year out. And God has positioned himself in such places of influence in the government with the infrastructure of that country. Huge places of influence in setting policies and guidelines. He is now in those places because he saw the world as a threat, as an engineer. And this is how God wants to move us, where we see, whether it's in culture, in the arts, whether it's in business, whether it's in engineering, whether it's in education or healthcare, you say, this world is an opportunity. And however you have wired me up, God, whatever passion you've put into me, whatever skill you've put in me, help me not to narrow it down just to my life. Give me your heart for the world, and let me see not only the world as an opportunity, let me see myself as an opportunity. And I will have this influence in the kingdom. He comes to Abraham. He says, Abraham, you got to decide how will you see the world. And it will greatly define how big of a life you live or how small of a life you live. Then he gives him a second story we're given in Hebrews with a question. Look with me at verse 11. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Now picture this. God comes to Abraham, and Abraham is not a believer. He wasn't raised in church. The Bible tells us he worshiped other gods. And God comes to him and says, I want to be your God. And Abraham has a choice. How will he define his relationship with God? The same thing happens to us, but we live in a much different situation now. So sometimes we don't have the dynamic drama of the calling of God because we're raised in the church, we attend the church. So here's the question I want to ask you as God expands our heart. Not just how do you see the world as a threat or an opportunity. How do you see your church? As a place you join or a place you've been called to? Now, Abraham didn't have a local church. It wasn't that season. But he didn't just join God. He had God actually call him. And it changed how he would see God's activity. He saw him called. He saw the promises of God. And a lot of times for us, when we look at our local church, we just see ourselves joining it. You say, Joel, why is that so important? Because individually, you can fulfill the Great Commission to your neighbor. You can walk across the street. You can talk to your neighbor about Jesus. You can invite your neighbor to church. You can do that individually. But to be a Christian who fulfills the uttermost parts of the earth, you can't do that individually. And you're not called to do that individually. We're called to do that collectively together as a church. So if you're going to have God's heart for the world, It's got to be based upon how you see your involvement in your local church. Do you just join your local church, or are you called to your local church? Because it sets your heart globally for what goes on. When you join your local church, you choose. You choose to become a member here. There are other churches, but this is the one that you like. When you're called to a church, then you say, God picked me. I'm here because God has brought me here. Now, both are true. You chose to come here. You don't have to come to Hope Center. But if all you're doing is choosing to come here as a church, here's what your response is tempted to be, and it narrows your heart. Your response to be is, I choose Hope Center for how it benefits me. It provides good teaching for me. It provides education for my children. It provides community for me. That's not bad. That's actually good. But it's limiting for your heart if that's the only way you see it. Because if you see it as, no, I'm actually called to this church, then it's no longer just what it provides for me, it gives me my purpose. I can live out the Great Commission for the uttermost parts of the earth because I'm called to be a part of this church in that way. Think of it this way. Ever join a health club? It always mystifies me, but that's me, that people would join a health club, that you would actually pay for pain. And then you would pay a personal trainer, like give him money to make your life even more miserable, you know? You join a health club, and there are benefits for you in that health club. But it's very individualistic. I go to the health club, I work out, I look in front of the mirror, and I go, wow, I look pretty good, and I pay for those benefits. You join a health club. But I think the church is not so much a health club. It's more like a lifesavers club where you join so that you are part of a purpose of watching people who may be drowning and going out to rescue those people so they will not drown. And how you see your identity in a local church really affects the heart you are willing God to give you. Because again, it doesn't begin with an institutional program. Here's what Hope Center is doing. Okay, I guess I can give some money to Hope Center for doing it. It begins with an individual passion. Here's what I'm a part of. And how, God, can you open my heart to what you want to do? Because you join something individually, but you are called to something together. And the reason why this is so important for our understanding, as we see God shift us as a church and grow us, is because when you talk about reaching the world, the temptation is that we inspire you and you misinterpret that to say, now I got to become the next Mother Teresa. I got to do something outrageous. And it's actually in some ways our fault because we put like Mother Teresa people up here and you hear their stories. And as much as they're inspiring, your conclusion also is, I could never do that. I could never do that. But when you are called to a church together, we all have our role to play, and together we do something for God. The Bible is really clear about this. It teaches this principle. Be who you are, do what you can. Doesn't sound very dynamic, does it? Be who you are, do what you can. And individually, I can be who I am. I can do what I can. Globally, very small. Collectively, we could do something really significant. But it doesn't begin with an institutional program. It begins with an individual passion. Let me give you my second hero. Last year, I was in Nepal, and I met a 27-year-old young man. He's very entrepreneurial. He's got 2 girls and a wife. So he started a restaurant because there are no jobs in Nepal. Very poor country. And he started his restaurant, and it was going pretty well, and then he looked around and he realized something. If you know anything about that region of the world, it's very impoverished, and one of the biggest problems they deal with, one of the greatest evils, is human trafficking. Young girls who are sold into the sex industry. The reason why it happens is an economic issue. Evil uses the bad economy. Because there are no jobs, most of the husbands and most of the dads leave their homes and go to another country, usually in the Middle East somewhere, Saudi Arabia or Yemen, and they become immigrant workers, and they stay there for 3 or 4 years working in construction. And a home back in Nepal that does not have a dad or a husband is an unprotected home. And daughters and wives now are unprotected from really evil people who will do evil things. And this young 27-year-old man said, I have a call here through this restaurant. It's my responsibility to have an influence in my world. And he began to only hire men so that dads would not have to leave to become immigrant laborers. And he said, I can't just be satisfied with my restaurant. I've got to multiply my restaurants. He now has 7 restaurants. And when I was talking to him, I asked him about these 7 restaurants. He said, I only hire men. He said, truthfully, Joel, women are better cooks. I have to train them a lot longer, but I only hire men for this purpose. I said, how many families do you think you have protected? He said, as far as I can count right now, I have protected probably 35 families who might have been victims to this. You go, Joel, wow, that's an amazing hero. He's not my hero. I mean, it's amazing, his story. Because as he explained his story to me, do you know what enabled him to expand? 3 Australian businessmen who gave him the capital to expand, that within a year he was able to pay back the loan. Be who you are. Do what you can. These 3 Australian businessmen on their own would have never been able to do that. But collectively, through their church, were able to be who they are, do what they can. And I was so grateful for 3 Australian businessmen who said, God, give me a bigger heart for the world. And use me the way you want to use me. And that they saw their church not just as a place they joined, but as a place they were called to. How do you see the world? As a threat or as an opportunity for God to expand your life and your heart? How do you see your church? Just as a place you join, like a health club, or a place you are called to, where your purpose, not just locally, but globally, can be fulfilled? Here's the third story. Look at Hebrews 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. And Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Here's the third question for you. How do you see God's blessings? To be kept or to be given? And this is not a question just around an offering. It's really around how you see your life. Because God comes to Abraham, and what he asks should offend us. He gives Abraham a promise, a blessing, and a son. And then years later, he comes to Abraham. He says, Abraham, you know your son Isaac? Yeah, I want you to kill him. This should offend us. It should offend our morality. What is God doing? What is he wanting to teach Abraham, and what is he wanting to teach us about his blessings? I want you to imagine with me God in heaven, and he's looking down at Abraham, and he has all of Abraham's heart, and then he gives him the blessing of a son. And like a dad, he looks at Abraham holding his son. You ever seen a dad hold his newborn son, and the tears that well up in your eye because you are so full of love for your son? And God begins to wonder to himself, I used to have all of Abraham's heart. Do I still have all of his heart? He watched Abraham teach his son how to walk, this 2-year-old, 1-year-old. And you ever seen a dad, when the son takes his first few steps, and the dad then picks him up with great pride and holds him up and says, good job, Isaac. God looks down at Abraham and he wonders, do I still have all of his heart? He sees Abraham take his young son out to go hunting. His young son, in his first step as a manhood, pulls the bow back and he shoots his first animal. And the buttons on Abraham's vest pop off with great pride over his son. And God looks down and he wonders, I used to have all of his heart. I gave him the blessing of a son. Do I still have all of his heart? And God comes to Abraham and he asks him for Isaac, not because God wants Isaac. He just wants to make sure he still has all of Abraham's heart. And in asking for Isaac, God is giving the best blessing to Abraham. Because the worst thing that can happen to Abraham and to us is when God gives us a blessing and we see it to be kept, not to be given, and the blessing becomes a curse. Think if Abraham would have said, no, God, he's mine. You don't get him back. Think of how that would have removed Abraham from God. Removed Abraham from God's purposes, removed Abraham from God's even greater blessing. See, the way you answer this question isn't just about an offering, it's about how you see your relationship with God and your calling with God, whatever environment he's put you into as a Christ follower. If you say, yes, God has blessed me, and let's be honest, for all of us in here, God has blessed us. Time, money, people, whatever it may be, family, we have the blessings of God. If you answer, the blessings of God are to be kept, you will see them like a piece of pie. I come from Chicago. If you're ever in Chicago, world's greatest piece of pie. It's fantastic, this deep dish pizza. It's a pie, but there's a limited amount of pieces on it. And when I see God's blessings as a piece of pie with a limited amount of pieces, I'm very careful how I give it out because I have a limited source. I'll give out a little bit of time, a little bit of money. I'll give out a little bit of love to people who really receive it. But if I give you love and you don't receive it, I'm not giving you any more because I have a limited amount. When the blessings of God are to be kept. But when the blessings of God are to be given, then it's no longer a pie that has limited pieces. Now it's a cup that overflows and overflows and overflows. How you see the blessings of God truly impacts how much you allow God to shape your heart as his heart for a world. Think of this story. God comes to Abraham and says, tomorrow morning, I want you to sacrifice your son. And Abraham has the whole night to think about it. Would you sleep that night? I don't think Abraham had a wink of sleep that night. He was plagued with this question: who does Isaac really belong to? Who do I really belong to? And he had to come to terms with how he would answer this and see the blessings of God. And if he answered it right, they're yours, God. And I'm yours, God. It would open the windows of heaven for his heart. But if he answered it wrong, God wouldn't abandon him. God wouldn't stop being in a relationship with him, but it would shrink his life into such a small way. I remember when my kids were little, like 2 and 3 years old, and I had so much to do, and I hadn't caught this yet. They were the blessings. But I saw it as a pie, limited. My time was limited, and I had a million things to do. And the kids, I had to put them to bed, and my 4-year-old daughter said, Daddy, read us a story, which is the worst thing you want to hear as a parent when you're putting your kids to bed and you have no time. Because the story can take a lot of time. And it's like, oh, I don't have time for this, but I'm a good dad. Okay, I'll read you a story. So I went to pick the shortest book. You ever done that as a dad? Pick the shortest book. And my daughter beat me to it, and she grabbed like a children's version of War and Peace, this massive book. And then you sit down, my daughter's on one side, my other daughter's on the other side, so I've got to read them, but I have no time for this. So you do the parenting trick of skipping pages. You ever done that? We're going to skip pages so they don't see them all. My daughter was too smart. No, Dad, you missed that page. And the whole time in my mind, I'm thinking, I don't have time for this. I don't have time for this. And the Holy Spirit whispered to my heart, Joel, who says you don't have time? Am I not the author and creator of time? How I had seen the blessing of God is to be kept, and I have a really limited amount of time. No, it's to be given to my children, and I have an abundance of time. Actually shaped my heart. Now that's easy when it's your kids and they're sitting on the couch next to you, but when it's people halfway around the world, it takes a measure of faith. It says, God, whatever blessings you've given me, I want to fulfill your commission to the world. Because those people, the hungry farmer who's never heard the gospel, the orphan in India, they don't come in here. So he says, you got to go to them. But you got to go to them with this kind of a heart. Do you see the world as a threat or an opportunity? It'll determine the shape and the size of a life you live. Do you see your church as someplace you've just joined? Or someplace you are called to, because it will determine your participation in his great commission to the world. Do you see his blessings as something to be kept or something to be given? Third hero, it's a lady I met in China. She got saved like a lot of people in rural China get saved. She went to a village. She lived in a village, and a lot of times you go to the center of the village almost every day to buy vegetables. And an evangelist will go to the center of the village, and he'll kind of relationally talk about Jesus. And there's just this spirit of revival, and so she was talking to an evangelist, and she gave her life to Christ. And then here's what takes place in these remote villages. Then somebody will invite that evangelist to their house, and very carefully and quietly, they will invite family members and friends together. 40 or 50 people gather in a house. And for 4 or 5 nights, the evangelist will preach to them. They all get saved, and then he's got to go on to another village. So this becomes a house church. And basically, usually, whoever's house it is in becomes the pastor of the church. So it's her and her husband, so they now became the pastor of the church, been saved for 4 days. Now they're the pastor of the church. I said, what do you do? And she said, the only thing we knew to do was to worship God and read our Bible. So we worshiped God and we read our Bible. She said, but as we read the Bible, we kept discovering that God kept telling us to go into the world, go into the world. So we as a church decided we must be obedient to God. Her husband was handicapped, so he couldn't walk around very well, so they said, you go into the world, I will stay home and pastor the church. So she began to walk from village to village, doing the same kind of thing. She'd go into a village, into the market square, she'd preach the gospel, go over to somebody's house, stay there for 4 or 5 days, start a church, go to another place. She started so many churches, and I asked her, were you ever bothered by the police, by the authorities? She said, never. Over 2 years, never. And then one time, at the end of 2 years, right before Christmas, the authorities came to me. I was in a village, and they said, you must stop what you're doing. And if you do not stop it, we will either throw you in jail or you'll pay a fine. That's how they pad their pockets. They charge you a fine, and then they keep the fine. She said, how am I to stop preaching the gospel? This is what God has called me to do. And they said, well, you're either going to have to pay a fine and go to jail then. She said, I had no money. She said, Joel, I reached into my pocket, and really, mysteriously, I felt something, and I pulled it out, and it was money. She said, Joel, honestly, I had nothing in my pockets, and there God had provided money. Now, me and my superficial thinking said, wow, God did a miracle to protect you. She said, no, that's not how the story goes. She said, I thought to myself, over 2 years, I've never been hassled once. Why now? God must be in this. Do you see the world as a threat, or do you see the world as an opportunity? She put her money back in her pocket, and she said, take me to jail. She said, the moment I walked into the cell, I knew exactly why I was there, because in the corner of this cell were 4 teenage girls who had been forced into prostitution, who now had skin diseases, who society had said, you are absolutely worth nothing. But God wanted them to know how valuable they were, so she sent this lady to them. She said, the first night, all I asked was, could I pray for you? And they said yes. And as Wayne said, which is so important, as a church, believing in the power and the presence of God, she prayed for them, and they were all supernaturally, miraculously healed. They all became Christ followers. She took the money that would have bought her freedom, and she bought their freedom and sent them back to her church, where they were raised up and now oversee churches throughout China. And you say, well, what happened to the lady? Yeah, it's okay, you can clap for God. What happened to the lady who was in prison? So many people in jail were getting saved that the jailer kicked her out and said, leave. You are creating more problems. Can I tell you something? That lady was trained by a pastor at Hope Center. Hope Center was willing to say, you know what? The blessings you've given us, God, of leaders and time and knowledge, we can't just keep it to ourselves. They're meant to be given. A heart for God's world does not begin with an institutional program. It begins with an individual passion. And you have to answer the question individually, how will I see the world? How will I see my church? And how will I see God's blessings? And if you answer it correctly, in faith, the season we are expanding into, how God can use us as a church to genuinely impact the world. Can I tell you one last thing? Jesus never asks us to do something he himself didn't do. He had a choice. Do I see the world as a threat or an opportunity? And he saw it as this opportunity for the kingdom of God. He felt a calling from the Father for the ministry the Son was to carry out. And the blessings that he had of the purity and the joy and the holiness of heaven. The Bible says he literally set aside his glory. He gave up his glory to join us, to die for us. So this weekend, we ask God simply to start us on our journey as a church individually with a heart shift. I'm going to give you a pet peeve of mine. I preach in places, and I don't like it when people come to me, and in commenting on my message, they say something like, oh, you really hit it out of the park. I say, we're not in a cricket match here. We're wanting God to speak to us. And we're going to close this service by just giving you a minute, whether you're at Morton or West or here in Brisbane. Beyond my limited human words, maybe you walked in here and when you look at your own neighborhood, let alone the world, there is fear. And God wants to minister to you in grace and say, no, this is your opportunity. Let me broaden your heart. Maybe if you were honest, wherever you attend, your mindset has been a little bit more of a local church as a health club that you join versus your purpose, where you are called to, where you have such a valuable contribution. Maybe if you were honest, you'd say, I look at God's blessings and I'm really grateful for them and I hold on to them and they're like a piece of pie and they're really limited. And in his grace and his goodness, he just wants to do this little shift of your heart to say, if you, like Abraham did, will trust me with a promise, knowing there is another life to come that really defines our existence, you'll be blown away by how I'll change your heart, how I'll expand your world.